Imagine this: a lonely night inside a dark factory. A security guard, with nothing but a weak flashlight, quietly reading a book. He had no idea that this small habit would one day change his entire life. And the man who noticed him wasn't just any worker, he was the hidden CEO of the company. This is not just a story, it's a piece of someone's hidden pain, quietly waiting to be heard. In today's story, we dive into a moment that can change everything, in the most unexpected way. Before we begin, where are you listening from? Canada, the US, Norway. Let us know in the comments, because stories may begin anywhere, but they connect us all. Stay with us until the very end, because sometimes, what breaks your heart can also heal it. And if you believe stories can change lives, hit subscribe. Join our journey. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment. Your voice matters here. The city of Halliton was a machine that never slept. By day, its glass towers glittered in the sun. By night, they shimmered like beacons of untouchable wealth. Inside one such tower, Alaric Morgan, the powerful CEO of Helix Industries, stood by his penthouse window, staring at the empire he had built with his own two hands. To the world, he was the epitome of success, a billionaire with influence stretching across continents. But lately, Alaric had begun to feel a gnawing emptiness, a hollow echo inside his chest. He wanted to see the truth, what people really thought of his company, how his employees lived, how his empire touched the ordinary lives beneath the skyscrapers. So, against every advice his board gave him, Alaric shaved his beard, traded his tailored suits for cheap department store clothes, and vanished into his own company as an undercover janitor. For weeks, he swept floors, carried boxes, and ate in the cramped break rooms where gossip thrived. He learned about employees' dreams, their struggles with rent, and their resentment at being invisible to the executives who ran their lives from above. But one cold winter night changed everything. While making his routine rounds, Alaric walked past a dimly lit corridor of the corporate building. There, hunched against the wall with a battered notebook and a cheap flashlight, sat Daniel Reyes, a security guard in his late 20s. His uniform was worn, his boots cracked, but his eyes burned with something Alaric hadn't seen in years: hunger for knowledge. Daniel was scribbling formulas, diagrams, and passages with the kind of focus that belonged not to a guard but to a scholar. Alaric froze, curiosity tightening his chest. Why would a man with such a humble job spend his lonely nights studying by flashlight, as if the future of his soul depended on it? That single moment would unravel secrets, break walls, and ultimately change both men's lives forever. Daniel had always been invisible. People walked past him without noticing. A shadow in a pressed uniform, a pair of eyes behind the security desk. But inside him lived two worlds, one of duty, the other of dreams. Every night, after checking the cameras and making sure the building was safe, he'd steal whatever time he could to study. His dream was engineering. Ever since he was a boy fixing radios in his mother's kitchen, he wanted to build machines that could help people, but poverty had caged him. His father, a factory worker, died in an accident. His mother cleaned houses to survive. College had been a dream too expensive to touch. Still, Daniel refused to surrender. He borrowed used textbooks from libraries, watched free lectures on an old second-hand phone, and copied every formula into his worn-out notebook. And so, every night under the pale glow of his flashlight, he studied, chasing a dream the world had denied him. That night, when the janitor, who was really Alaric in disguise, walked past and paused, Daniel didn't even notice. He was too deep in equations, his lips whispering calculations like prayers. Alaric's breath caught. Something about this young man's determination reminded him of his own past, the days he too had clawed his way from nothing. He wanted to speak, to ask, to understand, but he held back. Instead, he quietly observed from the shadows. For the first time in years, the billionaire CEO felt a spark of wonder. And as Alaric walked away that night, one thought echoed in his mind. This man doesn't belong in the shadows. But the next evening, Alaric would discover that Daniel's secret life was even more complicated and dangerous than he first thought. The next evening, Alaric returned to his undercover shift with an unusual restlessness in his chest. All day he had been distracted, his mind replaying the image of Daniel crouched in the dim corridor, his face lit only by the shaky beam of a cheap flashlight. It was not just the boy's persistence that struck him, but the desperation stitched into his very posture, as though every line of his body screamed, "I cannot give up." Alaric had known men with wealth beyond imagination who still whined about opportunities. And here was a security guard, fighting for a dream with nothing but a flashlight and a borrowed notebook. The hallways of Helix Tower were unusually quiet that night. The cleaning staff had already left, and the hum of the central heating was the only sound. Alaric pushed his mop cart slowly, listening, waiting. His pulse quickened when he spotted a faint glow spilling from the end of the corridor, the same place as before. Daniel was there again, sitting cross-legged on the cold marble floor, his uniform jacket folded under him like a cushion. His flashlight flickered against the pages of a heavy textbook, the kind used in college engineering courses. His lips moved silently, rehearsing equations, and occasionally he tapped the side of his pen against his chin, lost in thought. For several minutes, Alaric stood in the shadows, torn between approaching and retreating. The rational part of him whispered, "Don't interfere. He'll shut down if he knows someone's watching." But something deeper, something almost paternal, pushed him forward. Slowly, he stepped closer, until the creak of his work boots on the polished floor betrayed him. Daniel's head shot up. His eyes wide and guarded locked on Alaric. For a tense moment, neither spoke. Sorry, Alaric mumbled, lowering his gaze, playing the role of a simple janitor. Didn't mean to interrupt. Daniel closed his book quickly, almost protectively, as though it held a secret he couldn't risk sharing. "It's fine," he said, his tone clipped, defensive. Alaric hesitated, then nodded toward the notebook. "That's not the kind of thing most people study at this hour." Daniel's expression flickered, caught between suspicion and pride. He looked at the stranger with narrowed eyes, then shrugged. "Just trying to stay sharp." There was more to it. Alaric could feel it. But Daniel wasn't ready to open up, so Alaric leaned on his mop handle, letting the silence stretch. The quiet hum of the building seemed to press down on them, broken only by the distant thrum of traffic outside. Finally, Daniel sighed. "You wouldn't understand. Maybe I would," Alaric said softly, surprising even himself with the weight in his voice. Daniel studied him as though searching for signs of mockery. Seeing none, his shoulders loosened. He flipped his notebook open again, revealing pages filled with intricate sketches, bridges, engines, circuits. The drawings were astonishing, detailed with a precision that spoke of raw talent. "I want to be an engineer," Daniel admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I always have. But college," his throat tightened. "College costs more than I'll ever make here. So, I study when I can. Just in case someday an opportunity comes." The honesty in his words cut into Alaric's chest like glass. He remembered nights in his youth when he too had scribbled on scraps of paper under the dim light of a broken lamp, daring to dream while the world told him he wasn't enough. But before Alaric could respond, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed down the corridor. Daniel scrambled to hide his notebook, shoving it into his bag as a tall, sharp-featured man in a suit turned the corner. It was Mr. Grant, the head of building security. His eyes were cold, his smile thin. "Raise?" Grant barked, his voice slicing through the air. "What's this? Studying on company time again?" Daniel stood quickly, stiff as a soldier. "Sir, I was just—" "I don't want excuses," Grant snapped. His gaze swept over the janitor standing nearby. Alaric. Then back to Daniel. "You think we pay you to sit around with your nose in a book? This is a security post, not a library." Alaric clenched his fists, rage simmering in his chest. But he forced himself to stay silent, bound by his disguise. Grant leaned closer, his voice dripping with disdain. "You've been warned before. One more slip like this, and you can clear out your locker. Do you understand me?" Daniel's jaw tightened. He swallowed hard, his pride forcing him to meet the man's eyes even as fear flickered deep within them. "Yes, sir." Grant smirked, satisfied, and walked off with his polished shoes clicking against the marble. The silence that followed was suffocating. Daniel sank back against the wall, his shoulders heavy, his dreams crushed a little more by the weight of authority. Alaric wanted to tear the mask from his face, to scream at the injustice of it all, but he couldn't, not yet. Instead, he placed a hand gently on Daniel's shoulder. "Don't stop," he said, his voice low, filled with conviction. Daniel looked up, his eyes glistening, torn between hope and despair. "They'll fire me if they catch me again." Alaric met his gaze, a storm raging inside him. "Then maybe it's time someone made sure they see who you really are." And for the first time, Daniel sensed that the quiet janitor beside him might not be who he seemed. But Daniel had no idea that the man encouraging him was the most powerful figure in the building. And soon, his life would collide with that truth in ways neither could predict. The following night, the air inside the tower felt heavier, as if the walls themselves carried whispers from the encounter with Mr. Grant. Daniel was quieter than usual, his shoulders slumped as he walked his rounds, and when he finally settled into his usual corner with the flashlight, he hesitated before opening the notebook. His hands lingered on the cover, trembling slightly, as if even the simple act of studying now felt like rebellion. Alaric had been waiting for this moment all day. He'd replayed the scene over and over, the way Grant had sneered, the way Daniel had been forced to swallow his pride. Something in it had unsettled him more deeply than he wanted to admit. He wasn't used to feeling powerless, yet last night he had been just that, an undercover CEO trapped in a disguise, unable to wield his true authority. And so, instead of retreating, he found himself drawn again to the young man's struggle, compelled to understand the story that drove him. He pushed his mop down the corridor, his eyes darting toward Daniel. The guard looked up briefly, nodded, then returned to his book, though this time he sat straighter, more alert, ready to snap the notebook shut at the sound of footsteps. Alaric couldn't take the distance anymore. He abandoned his cart and walked closer, lowering his voice. "You didn't deserve what happened last night," he murmured. Daniel stiffened, his face shadowed in the dim glow. "You shouldn't have seen that. It's just how things are. Grant hates me. Thinks I'm wasting time." "You're not wasting anything," Alaric said firmly. His eyes lingered on the scrawled equations. "If anything, you're fighting for something bigger than this place." Daniel exhaled slowly, his defenses cracking just enough for truth to slip through. "I can't afford to fight, though. I need this job. My mom depends on me." Alaric's chest tightened. The words carried weight, pain carved into every syllable. He lowered himself to sit on the cold floor beside Daniel, ignoring the absurdity of a CEO, though disguised, pressing his back against the marble like a common worker. "Tell me," he urged gently. Daniel's gaze flickered with hesitation, but the loneliness of carrying his burdens alone pushed him to speak. "My mom's sick. Heart problems. She can't work anymore. The bills pile up faster than I can pay them. I take extra shifts, skip meals when I have to. And still, it's never enough. She deserves better." His throat caught, and he bit down hard on his lip. "I study because it's the only piece of hope I've got left. If I can find a way to become more than this uniform, maybe I can give her a life where she doesn't have to worry about dying in a cheap clinic bed." Alaric swallowed against the lump in his throat. He had heard board members speak of numbers, profits, margins, but here was the cost of their decisions in flesh and blood. A young man breaking himself to carry his mother's survival. The silence between them thickened, broken only by the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights above. Daniel suddenly snapped his notebook shut, panic flashing in his eyes. "Don't tell anyone what I said. Please. If Grant finds out, he'll find a reason to fire me. And then, I won't." Alaric promised, his voice steady. He leaned forward, his words weighted with sincerity. "But you have to promise me something too. Don't give up. No matter how many nights you have to sit in the dark with nothing but that flashlight, don't stop. People like you, they change the world." Daniel's eyes glistened, and for a moment he looked like a boy clutching onto the last threads of belief. He nodded, though doubt still clung to him. Before Alaric could say more, the sound of footsteps returned, this time heavier, more hurried. Daniel quickly shoved his notebook into his bag, his whole body taut with fear. The figure that rounded the corner wasn't Grant but another guard, a younger man named Lewis, whose face bore a mix of nerves and contempt. "There you are," Lewis hissed. "Grant's looking for you. Says he's got something on you this time. You'd better watch yourself, Rays. He's been talking about cutting staff." Daniel paled, his eyes darting toward Alaric before quickly masking his panic. "Thanks," he muttered, though his voice was hollow. Lewis smirked. "Some of us know how to keep our heads down. Maybe you should try it." Then he stalked off, leaving the corridor buzzing with unease. Daniel pressed a hand against his forehead, shaking slightly. "If he fires me now, my mom, I don't know what I'll do." Alaric's disguise suddenly felt unbearable. Every instinct screamed at him to reveal himself, to crush Grant with the weight of his authority, to save this young man who reminded him so much of the person he once was. But he couldn't, not yet. Not until he knew just how far Daniel's light could shine in the darkness. Still, as Daniel lifted his bag, ready to face whatever storm awaited him upstairs, Alaric realized one terrifying truth. If he didn't intervene soon, the world might stamp out this boy's brilliance before it ever had the chance to be seen. And he wasn't sure if he could live with that. The next day, Alaric would discover exactly how far Mr. Grant was willing to go to destroy Daniel, and it would force him to make a choice that could shatter his disguise forever. The morning began like any other, but for Daniel it carried the heaviness of dread. His shift had ended late, his mother had coughed through the night, and his body ached from exhaustion. Yet none of that compared to the thought of facing Mr. Grant again. The man had been circling him like a vulture, waiting for a misstep, and Daniel feared last night's warning meant the end was close. Still, he put on his uniform, buttoned it with trembling fingers, and walked into Helix Tower with his head held high, clinging to dignity even as fear gnawed at his stomach. Alaric, disguised in his janitor's clothes, was already inside. He had spent the morning sweeping the lobby floors, but his mind wasn't on the mop. It was on Daniel. Each passing hour tightened the knot in his chest. He had heard whispers among the staff, rumors that Grant was preparing to make an example out of someone. The name Daniel floated between conversations like an unspoken curse. By mid-afternoon, the tension finally cracked. Alaric watched as Grant stormed across the security office with a file clutched under his arm. His lips curled into that familiar, venomous smile. Daniel sat stiffly at his desk, his notebook hidden deep inside his bag, his hands gripping the edge of the table until his knuckles whitened. Grant slapped the file down in front of him. "Rays, care to explain this?" Daniel blinked confused. He opened the file hesitantly, his eyes scanning the pages, photocopied reports, camera stills. and a schedule showing times when he had been seen sitting in the corridors, flashlight in hand, notebook on his lap. The evidence was undeniable. "You've been using company time for your little hobby?" Grant sneered, savoring every word. "Studying when you should be on duty, endangering the safety of this building. Do you understand how serious this is?" Daniel's face burned, his throat tightened, but he forced his voice to remain steady. "I never neglected my duties. I only studied when the building was secure, when everything was quiet. Don't," Grant snapped. "Don't insult my intelligence. You're a distraction, a liability, and I won't have dreamers polluting my department." Alaric's hands curled into fists at his sides. He wanted to shout to expose Grant's cruelty for the farce it was, but he stayed still, his disguise shackling him in silence. His heart pounded so hard he thought it might crack his ribs. Daniel swallowed hard, desperation bleeding into his tone. "Please, sir, my record is spotless. I've never missed a shift, never been late, never failed to do my rounds. This is just me trying to learn, to be better. It doesn't interfere with my work." Grant leaned closer, his voice a low growl. "This company doesn't pay you to be better, Rays. It pays you to obey." The words sliced through Daniel, leaving him hollow. For a moment, silence hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Then Grant stood straight, his expression cold and final. "You're done here. Clear out your locker by the end of the day." Daniel's world collapsed in a heartbeat. His vision blurred, his chest constricted, and the floor seemed to tilt beneath him. All he could think of was his mother, her weak smile when he left for work, the pills lined neatly on her nightstand, the rent envelope tucked under a stack of bills. Without this job, there would be no rent, no medicine, no hope. Alaric took a step forward before he realized it. His mouth opened, words trembling on the edge of spilling out. But then he froze. To reveal himself now would mean ending the undercover mission he had begun, the one meant to expose the unseen struggles within his company. If he stepped in too soon, Daniel might never trust him again. He would only see a CEO swooping in with pity. Alaric's chest ached with the weight of restraint. Daniel's voice cracked as he spoke. "Please, just give me one more chance. I can stop studying at work. I'll never open another book here. Just I can't lose this job." Grant's smile was cruel. "That's the problem, Rays. I don't believe you." The file snapped shut, the sound echoing like a verdict. Grant walked out without another word, leaving Daniel staring at the papers that condemned him. His hands shook as he gathered them, his mind unraveling under the weight of impending ruin. Alaric stayed rooted in the shadows, his jaw clenched so tightly it hurt. Rage burned through him, but beneath it, something sharper pulsed. Resolve. He couldn't let this happen. Not to Daniel. Not to a man who carried so much potential in his battered notebook. But then, as Daniel lowered his head into his hands, something unexpected happened. His phone buzzed against the desk. He glanced at the screen, and all color drained from his face. His mother's name flashed across it, but the message below was from the hospital critical condition. "Please come immediately." Daniel's breath hitched. His world, already crumbling, shattered completely. He grabbed his bag, stuffed the notebook inside, and bolted out of the room. Alaric stood frozen, torn between his disguise and the overwhelming need to follow. Because in that moment, he realized the battle was no longer just about saving a job. It was about saving a life. And if he didn't act now, both Daniel and his mother might be lost forever. As Daniel rushed toward the hospital, unaware of the janitor trailing close behind, neither knew that the truth about who Alaric really was would soon collide with the darkest night of their lives. The night outside was bitterly cold, the kind that cut straight through a man's clothes and sank into his bones. Daniel barely noticed it as he ran through the streets, his breath coming in sharp bursts, his mind spinning with fear. The message on his phone replayed over and over, critical condition. Those two words clawed at his chest with every step. He had no money for proper treatment, no savings to cover the hospital bills. All he had was his presence, and the desperate hope that somehow, just being there would make a difference. Alaric followed at a distance, his disguise still intact. He told himself it was to protect his mission, to keep Daniel from realizing who he truly was until the time was right. But the truth was simpler and far more human. He couldn't stand the thought of letting this young man face his darkest hour alone. The sight of Daniel sprinting, his bag bouncing against his back, stirred memories Alaric had buried years ago. Memories of running to hospitals himself, too late, with too much regret. When Daniel burst through the glass doors of Hallaton General, he was met with the sterile brightness of the emergency ward. The air was thick with antiseptic and the hum of machines, but all he heard was his own heart pounding in his ears. He rushed to the front desk, nearly colliding with a nurse. "My mother, Elena Reyes, they called me." "Where is she?" His voice cracked, urgency bleeding into panic. The nurse glanced at her clipboard, her expression tightening. "She's in intensive care. Room 314. But you'll have to." Daniel didn't wait for the rest. He pushed past, ignoring the protests, his footsteps echoing down the corridor. Behind him, Alaric entered quietly, keeping his distance, blending in with the wary relatives that haunted hospital hallways. When Daniel reached the room, he froze at the sight of his mother. Elena lay small and fragile against the white sheets, her chest rising shallowly, her face pale. Tubes and wires tethered her to machines that beeped with mechanical indifference. Her eyes fluttered open at the sound of his voice. "Mom," Daniel whispered, rushing to her side, gripping her frail hand. "I'm here. I'm right here." She smiled weakly, her lips trembling. "Mihijo, you came so fast." Her voice was barely a breath. "I'll always come. Always." He pressed his forehead to her hand, trying to mask the tears threatening to spill. Alaric stood just outside the doorway, hidden by the shadow of the corridor. The scene cut through him like glass. This wasn't just about a struggling worker anymore. This was about a son carrying the crushing weight of a mother's life on his shoulders, with nothing but grit and hope to hold him upright. A doctor entered briskly, flipping through a chart. He glanced at Daniel, his expression firm but not unkind. "Your mother's condition has worsened. Her heart is failing faster than we anticipated. We need to perform a procedure immediately." Daniel's head shot up. "Do it, please, whatever it takes." The doctor hesitated, lowering the chart. "It's not that simple. The surgery and post-care are expensive. Without insurance or proof of financial coverage." His voice trailed off, the meaning clear. Daniel's stomach dropped. He had heard these words before. Always the same walls, the same cruel reminder that hope was a luxury for the rich. His chest tightened with helplessness. "I don't care about money. I'll find a way. Just save her." The doctor's eyes softened, but his hands remained tied. "Hospital policy, son. Without payment or a guarantee, we can't proceed." Daniel gripped the edge of the bed, his knuckles white, his whole body trembling with rage and despair. "So you're telling me she could die tonight because we're poor?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Outside the door, Alaric's blood boiled. He had built an empire, one that boasted of innovation and progress, yet here was a woman's life reduced to a line item on a ledger. The injustice clawed at him until he could barely breathe. He had the power to change this in an instant, but if he stepped in now, the truth of who he was would unravel everything. Inside, Alina reached for her son's hand with surprising strength. "Daniel, listen to me. You've done enough. Don't carry this burden alone. Promise me," her eyes shone with tears. "Promise me you won't give up on your dream, no matter what happens to me." Her words shattered him. How could he promise when his dream meant nothing if she wasn't there to see it? He bowed his head, his tears falling onto her hand. "I can't lose you, Mom. I can't." Alaric's chest ached with the weight of his own memories. His father gasping for breath in a hospital bed, his own powerless hands gripping the sheets. He remembered the rage, the helplessness, the vow he had made never to be weak again. And now, watching Daniel, he realized this was the same story repeating, another son about to be broken by the cruelty of a system he himself profited from. The doctor checked his watch, his tone clipped. "We don't have much time. Decide quickly." Daniel's voice broke as he shouted, "I'll pay. I'll work 24 hours a day. I'll sell everything I own. His words collapsed under the weight of futility. He had nothing to sell, nothing left to give. And that was the moment Alaric stepped back from the door, his fists clenched. His disguise, his mission, his careful plan, it all trembled on the edge of collapse. Because if he didn't act tonight, he would be forced to watch history repeat itself, and Daniel's light would be extinguished forever. As Daniel sank to his knees beside his mother's bed, Alaric made a silent decision, the kind that would tear the mask off his identity and alter the course of both their lives in one irreversible move. The rain had stopped by morning, but the clouds hung low, heavy with the memory of the storm. James woke earlier than usual, restless after the conversation he'd had with Daniel the night before. His words echoed like a haunting refrain, dreams larger than the uniform he wore, hope stitched together in the faint light of a dying flashlight. James sat at the small desk in his hotel suite, staring out the window at the city skyline. Beneath all its shining towers and glass facades were countless lives like Daniel's, hidden in shadows, unnoticed and unheard. By the time he walked into the lobby, James had almost convinced himself that he was overthinking. But when he saw Daniel standing by the entrance, alert and composed despite the exhaustion that lingered in his eyes, all doubts disappeared. This was no ordinary man. There was something about the quiet resilience in his posture, the way he nodded politely to guests who brushed past him without even glancing back. It wasn't just duty, it was dignity. James lingered near the front desk, pretending to check a newspaper while watching Daniel discreetly. He saw how the guard greeted a young couple with a warm smile, how he helped an elderly man steady himself on the wet floor, and how he patiently answered questions from a tourist who spoke broken English. Every gesture carried respect, even when none was shown to him in return. Later that evening, James found himself drawn back to the dim corridor near the storage closet. His footsteps echoed as he approached. And there it was again, the faint glow of Daniel's flashlight flickering through the crack in the door. Heart pounding with a mixture of curiosity and guilt, James pushed the door open softly. Daniel looked up sharply, eyes wide with alarm. The thick book lay open on his lap, and for a moment, he seemed frozen, like a child caught doing something forbidden. James raised a hand quickly, offering reassurance. "Don't worry," James said gently. "I didn't mean to startle you." Daniel's shoulders eased a little, but his voice carried hesitation. "Most people don't come here. It's just quieter than the lobby." James stepped inside, the hum of silence wrapping around them. He glanced at the book, Economics, thick with annotations scribbled in the margins. He swallowed, moved by the effort poured into every note. "You're studying." Daniel shifted uncomfortably, his fingers brushing the edges of the pages. "Trying to. I know it looks strange, but I've always wanted to finish my degree. Nights are the only time I get." His voice cracked with the weight of hidden sacrifice. "I promised myself I wouldn't let go of learning, no matter how hard life got." James felt his throat tighten. He wanted to tell him everything, that he wasn't just another guest, that he could change his life in ways Daniel couldn't imagine. But instead he asked, "Why economics?" Daniel's eyes lit up faintly, like embers stirred in ash. "Because I want to understand how things work. The world, businesses, opportunities, people like me. We're always told where to stand, what to do, when to leave. I want to know how to make choices, how to build something of my own. Knowledge feels like freedom." Silence stretched, heavy with emotion. James leaned against the wall, his heart aching at the sight of this man's quiet determination. Daniel wasn't chasing glory, he was chasing a chance to breathe beyond survival. But before James could say more, the sound of approaching footsteps broke the moment. Daniel quickly shut the book, his flashlight snapping off in an instant. The storage room plunged into darkness. They waited, listening to the muffled laughter of two employees passing by. When the sounds faded, Daniel exhaled sharply. "This has to stay between us," he whispered urgently. "If management finds out, they'll think I'm neglecting my duty. I can't afford to lose this job." James nodded slowly, torn between his cover and his conscience. "Your secret is safe," he promised, though inside, he knew secrets could only last so long. As he left the storage room that night, James's mind churned with conflict. Every instinct told him Daniel deserved more. An opportunity, a door that had always been locked to him. Yet, revealing his identity too soon might shatter the fragile trust building between them. But then a new thought crept into his mind like a dangerous seed. If Daniel's passion for learning was this strong, what would happen when others in power discovered it? Would they crush him for daring to dream, or exploit him for their own gain? James realized with a jolt of fear that Daniel's future was balanced on a knife's edge. And unless he acted wisely, the wrong person might notice the guard before he could protect him. The storm outside had passed, but James knew another far greater one was already on its way. The following evening carried a strange tension in the air. Alexander arrived at the building earlier than usual, restless after the conversation he had had with Ethan. The boy's honesty about his family situation and his struggles at school had awakened something in him. Something Alexander hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long while, the CEO felt compelled to care not only about numbers and profits, but about a single human story written in the margins of his empire. He sat in his office with the lights dimmed, waiting, listening to the hum of the city outside, until the clock struck midnight. That was usually when Ethan would settle into his corner with his flashlight and books. Tonight, Alexander wanted to be there before him. When the young guard finally appeared, balancing his flashlight, textbooks, and a small thermos, he stopped in his tracks. Alexander was already sitting on the cold marble floor near the security desk, looking oddly out of place in a simple dark coat. Ethan's brows shot up in surprise. "Sir, what are you doing here?" he asked cautiously, setting his things down. "Waiting for you," Alexander replied quietly. His voice lacked the usual sharpness, instead carrying a softness that unsettled Ethan. "I thought maybe we could study together." The boy blinked, unsure if this was some kind of test. "You study? With me," he said, a nervous laugh escaping. "Why not?" Alexander said, unfolding one of Ethan's books, a thick volume on business strategy. "I might learn something too." His tone was half teasing, but his eyes betrayed something else, a hunger for understanding, for connection. Ethan hesitated but finally sat down. He opened his notebook, pages filled with tiny, neat handwriting, formulas and underlined words. Alexander watched silently, taking in the effort poured into each page. He had executives with degrees from prestigious universities, yet few displayed the same kind of dedication. They began reading side by side. At first, Alexander asked simple questions. What does this model mean? Why is this principle important? And Ethan, though nervous, explained with clarity and passion. The boy's face lit up as he described case studies and problem-solving methods, his voice gaining confidence. You really understand this? Alexander said after a while, his gaze thoughtful. Ethan shrugged shyly. I try. I don't have much, but knowledge is something no one can take away from me. If I want to change my life, this is the only way. The words hit Alexander harder than he expected. He remembered his own youth, the nights he stayed awake scribbling ideas, dreaming of building something from nothing. Somewhere along the way, that fire had turned cold beneath piles of contracts and mergers. Now here was this boy, reminding him of everything he had lost in the pursuit of success. Just as the moment grew heavy, a loud metallic clang echoed down the hall. Both turned their heads sharply. Ethan stood, flashlight in hand, his instincts as a guard kicking in. Stay here, he said firmly, and hurried toward the source of the noise. Alexander, stubborn and curious, followed. They found the service door slightly ajar, the cold night wind whistling through. A figure in a dark hoodie darted out into the alley beyond. Without hesitation, Ethan sprinted after him, his steps quick and sure despite exhaustion. Alexander trailed behind, his heart pounding in a way it hadn't in years, not from fear, but from adrenaline. The chase was brief but intense. Ethan cornered the intruder behind a dumpster, holding his flashlight like a weapon. Show your hands, he demanded, breath heavy. The hooded man froze before suddenly bolting past Ethan, shoving him hard against the wall. Alexander instinctively grabbed the intruder's arm, surprising himself with his strength. The man wriggled free and disappeared into the shadows, but not before dropping something metallic on the ground. Ethan bent to pick it up, a crowbar. His jaw tightened. He was here to break in. Alexander, still catching his breath, looked at Ethan differently now. Not just as a boy with big dreams, but as someone brave, alert, and willing to risk himself for a company that barely noticed his existence. Back inside, Ethan slumped into the chair, rubbing his arm where he had been shoved. Sorry, he muttered. I should have caught him. You protected this place better than half the systems I've paid millions for. Alexander said sharply, then softened his tone. Don't apologize for being brave. Ethan looked up, confused by the sincerity in the older man's voice. You talk like you own the place. For a split second, Alexander froze. The boy's words cut dangerously close to the truth. He forced a small laugh. No, just maybe I care more than most. The air between them grew thick with unspoken truths. Ethan stared at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Well, thanks. For helping. Alexander didn't reply. He simply sat back down on the marble floor, heart still racing, and opened Ethan's book again. But deep inside he knew something irreversible had shifted. The mask of the undercover CEO was beginning to crack, and the boy was starting to see through. And as dawn's first light touched the city skyline, Alexander realized with a strange mix of fear and excitement that this was only the beginning. The night was unusually quiet, the kind of silence that made even the faint hum of fluorescent lights seem louder than usual. Ethan sat in his office, the weight of the company's future pressing heavily against his chest. He had spent the past weeks living two lives, one as the CEO hidden in plain sight, and the other as the anonymous man who wandered the late night halls of his own company, finding pieces of truth he had never seen before. But tonight, something about that silence gnawed at him, as though the air itself carried a secret waiting to be unveiled. He left the comfort of his office, choosing instead the dimly lit corridors that stretched like veins through the building. His steps echoed against the marble floor, but it was another sound, a faint rustle, that made him stop. He turned the corner, and there was Daniel, crouched against the wall near the emergency stairwell, his flashlight balanced on his knee, a heavy textbook spread open before him. His lips moved as he mouthed the words silently, his brows furrowed with determination. Ethan froze in the shadows, captivated. This was no casual reading. Daniel was dissecting formulas, scribbling notes into a battered notebook that had clearly been used for years. Every page seemed filled with careful handwriting, diagrams, and problems worked out meticulously. The boy wasn't merely curious, he was hungry. Hungry for knowledge, for change, for something larger than the uniform he wore and the badge that hung tiredly from his chest. A part of Ethan wanted to step forward, to reveal himself and ask questions that had been clawing at his mind for days. But before he could, the faint creak of the stairwell door interrupted the moment. Daniel jolted, slamming the book shut, panic flashing across his eyes. He stuffed the notebook into his bag and scrambled to his feet, straightening his uniform as though hiding his guilt. A woman's voice called faintly from below. Daniel, are you up there again? It was an older woman's voice, soft but tinged with wariness. Daniel's face twisted, caught between shame and duty. He leaned over the stairwell rail, replying in a hushed voice. Yeah, Ma, just checking the upper floors. I'll be down in a minute. Ethan's heart tightened. His mother. She was here. Curiosity pulled him closer, and he moved silently until he could see through the opening in the stairwell. A woman sat a few flights below, wrapped in a simple coat, her face pale under the dim yellow light. She looked ill, her features drawn with fatigue, her body hunched as though weighed down by invisible burdens. Daniel hurried down to her, slipping an arm beneath hers to help her stand. "I told you to stay home, Ma," Daniel whispered, his voice trembling with both love and frustration. "You shouldn't be here." "I wanted to see you," she replied, her hand brushing against his cheek. "You've been working so hard. I just needed to know you're okay." Ethan's chest constricted as he watched the exchange. He had expected ambition in Daniel, maybe even stubborn resilience, but he hadn't expected this deep well of sacrifice. The boy wasn't merely chasing a dream for himself. He was carrying his mother along with him, dragging both of them through the mud of struggle, refusing to let her down. "Don't worry about me," Daniel whispered, guiding her carefully to the ground floor. "One day, I'll get us out of this. I'll finish my studies, I'll get a real job, and you'll never have to lift a finger again. That's a promise." Those words struck Ethan harder than any boardroom negotiation ever had. He followed quietly from a distance, watching them disappear into the night beyond the glass doors. Daniel wasn't just surviving, he was fighting for someone else's future. Back in his office, Ethan couldn't sit still. Every number on the report scattered across his desk suddenly felt meaningless compared to what he had just seen. For the first time in years, he questioned the walls he had built around himself, the distance he had created between his wealth, and the raw struggles of those below him. Daniel's fire was unlike anything he had witnessed in his executives, and it burned brighter because it wasn't selfish. It was fueled by love, but a shadow of fear crept in too. What if Daniel's light dimmed before it had the chance to shine? What if his struggles crushed him before opportunity found him? Ethan knew he couldn't stand by. The next day, whispers circled the office. A rumor spread that someone had been caught on the upper floors at night, though no one seemed to know who. Security footage had conveniently glitched during those hours, leaving no proof. Ethan smiled to himself, erasing the thought of revealing what he knew. At least, not yet. That evening, he went back again, determined to speak with Daniel. But when he arrived at the stairwell, Daniel wasn't there. The book, the flashlight, the notes, they were gone. Instead, Ethan found a small folded piece of paper wedged between the steps. He picked it up, unfolded it, and read the words scrawled inside. "One day I'll change everything. You'll see." Ethan stared at the note, his pulse racing. This wasn't just ambition. It was a vow, a prophecy of sorts. The boy was daring the universe to notice him. For the first time in years, Ethan felt alive, caught in a story much bigger than himself. And deep down, he knew, whatever Daniel's path was, he couldn't remain a silent observer anymore. Would Daniel discover the truth about who he really was before Ethan had the chance to act? Or would the weight of secrecy crush everything before it had a chance to begin? The following week weighed heavily on Ethan's shoulders. He couldn't focus on board meetings, quarterly reports, or expansion plans. Every time a polished executive spoke about profit margins, his mind drifted back to Daniel, hunched over his books in that cold booth with nothing but a weak flashlight guiding him. He had seen determination before. Ambitious graduates, rising managers, entrepreneurs, but nothing like this. Daniel's hunger for knowledge wasn't fueled by greed or status. It was raw survival, the unshakable belief that tomorrow could be brighter if only he worked hard enough today. Ethan started to follow Daniel from a distance, careful not to be noticed. He saw him share his lunch with the janitor, help a struggling employee lift heavy boxes, and even greet the delivery truck drivers by name. Everyone respected him, yet no one knew the storm he carried inside. One evening, as rain lashed against the glass walls of the building, Ethan saw Daniel pull out a small, crumpled photograph from his wallet. He held it against his chest, whispering words Ethan couldn't hear. The gesture was tender, almost desperate. That photograph wasn't just a memory, it was an anchor. Ethan realized Daniel wasn't only studying for himself. Someone else's future was tied to those books. The mystery gnawed at Ethan until he couldn't bear it anymore. He waited until Daniel finished his shift, trailing him through the quiet streets. Daniel lived in a cramped apartment on the edge of the city, in a building whose paint had long since peeled, and whose stairwell light flickered like a dying star. Through a broken curtain, Ethan glimpsed a scene that made his breath catch. Daniel sitting at a small table, a little girl curled beside him with her head on his arm. Her clothes were worn, her shoes too small, but her eyes shone as she looked up at him. Daniel opened the same thick textbook he had at work and explained something softly, tracing lines with his finger while the girl nodded. Ethan realized the truth. Daniel wasn't just studying for himself, he was learning so he could teach her. The little girl, no older than 8, scribbled with a broken pencil in a battered notebook. Her laughter was soft but filled with trust. Ethan's chest tightened, guilt washing over him. He had built empires, but when had he last given this much to another human being? The next morning, Ethan returned to the office more distracted than ever. His disguise was starting to slip. Colleagues noticed his unusually silent demeanor, his hesitation in responding to casual jokes. But what consumed him was not the boardroom anymore. It was the story of the security guard who burned his candle at both ends, fighting for something greater than himself. That night, Ethan made a bold choice. He approached Daniel directly, still in his disguise. As the clock neared midnight, he walked up to the booth, pretending to be just another employee leaving late. "Why do you do it?" Ethan asked quietly, his voice carrying the weight of curiosity and respect. Daniel stiffened, startled by the question. "Do what?" he replied cautiously. Ethan nodded at the stack of books. "All this. Every night. You're not just studying for a degree, are you?" For a long moment, Daniel said nothing. His hands tightened around the pen, his eyes scanning Ethan as though deciding whether to trust him. Finally, he sighed. "It's not just for me. It's for her. My daughter. She deserves better than this, better than me standing guard at doors while the world moves on. I want to give her the life she dreams of." His voice cracked on the last word, but he quickly straightened, as if ashamed of showing weakness. Ethan's heart clenched. He wanted to reach out, to tell Daniel that his struggle mattered, that his sacrifice was already heroic. But he couldn't. Revealing his true identity now might shatter everything. So instead he offered a small, quiet response. "She's lucky to have you." Daniel gave a tired smile, his eyes glistening. "No, I'm the lucky one. She's the reason I keep going." As Ethan walked away, the storm inside him grew fiercer. He had built his empire on numbers and strategy, but what Daniel carried, the weight of love, sacrifice, and hope, was something no balance sheet could ever measure. That night, Ethan knew his next move would not only change Daniel's life, it would change his own. But just as he resolved to act, a shadowy figure stepped into the hallway outside the booth, watching Daniel with sharp eyes. Ethan froze in place, realizing for the first time that he wasn't the only one observing Daniel's secret life. And whoever this stranger was, their intentions didn't feel kind. The following days unfolded like the slow turning of a page in a book that neither Ethan nor Daniel wanted to end. Ethan was no longer the invisible security guard who had spent nights studying in the shadows. He was now a young man whose story had lit a spark in the heart of a powerful CEO. But he still didn't know the full truth, that the mentor, guiding him all along, was the very man who owned the empire whose hallways he had patrolled. Daniel had hidden his identity well, wearing humility like a cloak, but the time for truth was nearing, and with it came a storm of emotions he wasn't sure Ethan was ready for. On a rainy Thursday evening, Ethan rushed into the CEO's office, clutching an envelope in his hand. His clothes were damp, his hair disheveled, but his eyes carried a fire that could not be extinguished. "Mr. Daniels," he said breathlessly, placing the envelope on the desk. "I got it. I got the acceptance letter. They want me. I'm in." His voice broke with joy, the words trembling as though they carried the weight of every sleepless night, every page read under the dim glow of a flashlight. Daniel, seated in his tall leather chair, leaned forward. He wanted to smile. He wanted to congratulate Ethan like a proud father, but something heavier tugged at him. "That's incredible, Ethan," he said softly. "You've earned it more than anyone I've ever met." His voice, though warm, carried an undertone of finality that Ethan didn't catch. Ethan paced the office, unable to contain his excitement. Can you believe it? After all these months, after all the doubts, all the times people said I wasn't good enough, I'm going to study business and economics at the university. Maybe one day I can build something of my own. And it's all because you believed in me when no one else did. Daniel's chest tightened. The words struck him like a blade. He knew the moment was near, the moment when the truth could no longer stay buried. Yet he hesitated, staring at the young man who had reminded him of the value of dreams, of resilience, of never underestimating those who seemed invisible. "Ethan," Daniel finally said, his voice low, "there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you a long time ago." The room grew still, the hum of the rain outside the only sound. Ethan turned, his smile faltering. "What is it?" he asked, sensing the weight in Daniel's tone. Daniel rose from his chair and walked to the window, his reflection blurred by raindrops. For a moment he saw himself not as the CEO, not as the man of wealth and power, but as someone humbled by the strength of another's will. "I'm not just Daniel, the mentor, the friend you've confided in. I'm Daniel Hartwell, the CEO of this entire company, the man whose name is on every paycheck here, including yours." The words landed like thunder. Ethan's jaw dropped, his mind racing. He stepped back, his heart pounding. You're the CEO?" His voice cracked, disbelief flooding through him. "All this time, why didn't you tell me?" Daniel turned, his expression raw with honesty. "Because I wanted to see who you truly were without the shadow of my title looming over you. I wanted to know if your dreams were real, if your heart was strong enough to carry the weight of ambition without being tainted by greed or flattery. And you showed me something I had long forgotten, that greatness isn't born from privilege, but from persistence." Ethan's eyes burned with tears, though he tried to blink them away. You believed in me when no one else did, even when I didn't know who you really were. His voice broke. All those nights I thought I was invisible. You saw me. Daniel stepped closer, placing a hand firmly on Ethan's shoulder. You were never invisible, Ethan. You were a light in the darkness, even when all you had was a flashlight to guide you. Silence hung heavy between them, but it was not an empty silence. It was filled with understanding, gratitude, and a bond forged in the most unlikely of places. After a long pause, Ethan whispered, "So what happens now?" Daniel smiled faintly, his eyes glistening. "Now you go and chase that future you've fought for. But you won't be alone. I want to sponsor your entire education, every last expense. Consider it not as charity, but as an investment in a man I know will one day change the world." Ethan's knees almost buckled at the words. He shook his head in disbelief, his tears finally spilling. "I don't even know what to say." "Say you'll never stop fighting?" Daniel replied softly. "Say you'll never let your circumstances define you again." Ethan nodded, his voice hoarse. "I promise." The rain outside softened, as though the heavens themselves had paused to witness the moment. Two men, one with power, one with perseverance, stood together, their lives forever altered by an encounter that began in the quiet, forgotten corners of a building. As Ethan left that night, clutching both his acceptance letter and the promise of a future he had once thought impossible, Daniel remained by the window. For the first time in years, he felt truly alive, not because of his wealth, not because of his empire, but because of the reminder that sometimes the greatest fortune lies not in what you build, but in the people you believe in. And so the story that began with a flashlight in the dark ended with a light that neither man would ever forget. A light born of faith, resilience, and the courage to see beyond the surface.
This is the story of a humble security guard who studied under a faint flashlight, chasing dreams bigger than his world would allow. Unknown to him, the man who watched silently from the shadows was the undercover CEO. What began as a secret test turned into a journey of trust, betrayal, and redemption, leading to a choice that would change both their lives forever.